In January 1901, Britain and the Empire mourned the passing of an era. For more than 6 decades, Queen Victoria had stamped her presence on the throne with a dignified and sober authority. Now, few could imagine life without her.
People were dreading the death of Queen Victoria, partly because she was a fixture of everybody's lives, but also because they were rather worried about the kind of king her son would make. You know, would this man be a worthy successor? There had been very little evidence that he would.
There was a very strong feeling that he wasn't up to much. He was nicknamed Edward the Caresser, as opposed to Edward the Confessor. There was a lot of talk that, you know, he was a vulgar Philistine, and that he would be quite incapable of the gravitas and the sort of, you know, the mastery that you needed to be king.
King Edward VII, known to the family as Bertie, couldn't have had a more different public image from that of his mother. Fat, 59 years old, and with a reputation for frivolity, Bertie had been pursued by scandal and written off as an idle playboy prince.
Basically, nobody thought that Bertie was going to be a good king. Not even Bertie, actually. It's widely attested that he was quite depressed at the time that he became king, because I think he really thought nobody would respect him and he wasn't going to manage. So it was a very inauspicious start.
Before he'd even been crowned, it seemed the new king was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But Edward VII's popular touch would turn out to be his secret weapon. The man of whom many predicted disaster turned out to be the king who reinvented monarchy for the modern age. In the 1840s, Queen Victoria and her consort Prince Albert embarked on a mission. Under the reign of their predecessors, the high-living Hanoverians, the monarchy had become a byword for corruption and immorality. Victoria and Albert believed that if it was to survive in an era of revolution, the royal family must become a model of public duty and immaculate private morality.
Albert and Victoria were very aware of the sort of the Hanoverian hangover, this moral legacy, particularly from the Regency days. The irony was Victoria was a highly sexed individual and enjoyed her sex life and revelled in it and, you know, explored it and wrote about it and all the rest of it. But they knew that the symbol of monarchy had to be a far more moral endeavour.
Central to Victoria and Albert's plans was their first son and heir, Bertie, Prince of Wales. To groom the boy for kingship, they subjected him to a grueling programme of moral and intellectual enlightenment.
Prince Albert had an idea that princes sort of had to be kind of super people, and he developed this educational regime for his children, whereby pretty much every waking moment was stuffed with improving educational experiences from the age of about 3. And constantly impressed on Bertie was the fact that he was going to be king, and he had to be good, and he had to achieve, and everything had to be improving, and it was suffocating.
His whole day was parcelled out, half hour by half hour, into lessons from about sort of, you know, early in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. And he behaved appallingly. He behaved like the sort of legendary naughty boy. He stood in the corner and stamped and screamed. He behaved as abominably as he possibly could. He refused to work.
Today, I had to do some arithmetic with the Prince of Wales. Immediately, the pencil was flung to the end of the room. The stool was kicked away. The prince was very rude, throwing stones in my face.
Bertie's parents were in despair.
I never in my life met such a thorough and cunning lazybones. It does grieve me when it is my own son, and that he might be called upon at any moment to take over the reins of a country where the sun never sets.
His intellect, alas, is weak. He listens to nothing you tell him, but seems in a sort of dreaminess, which alarms us for his brain.
Victoria and Albert are pretty upset, anxious and confused by their son's refusal to respond to this educational plan. They bring in a phrenologist, a man called George Combe. Phrenology was this sort of mid-19th century pseudoscience that declared that if you felt the bumps on a person's head, then you could determine something about their character, about the way that they were put together. Now, Combe felt all over young Bertie's head and declared that his centres of self-esteem were too highly developed.
The boy is a nervous and excitable child with little power of endurance or sustained action in any direction. The brain is feeble and abnormal, making him liable to fits of passion and obstinacy.
Despite Bertie's lack of academic promise, at the age of 17 he was packed off to university. The prince took every opportunity to give his royal minders the slip and applied himself enthusiastically to the study of gambling, horses and strong cigars.
Bertie desperately wanted friends. He really wanted to meet, boys of his own age. That's what he really wanted. He wanted friendship. He's not ever allowed to sort of rub shoulders with people as equals, of his own age. He never goes to anywhere near a school. And even when he goes to university, Albert is terribly careful to ensure that he is secluded. So he is brought up very much in isolation. And this, for him, was really difficult because he was by nature an incredible extrovert.
Despairing of his son's academic abilities, in 1861 Prince Albert decided to knock his son into shape with a taste of military life. Bertie was ordered to attend an army camp in Ireland. But if Albert hoped boot camp would be the making of his son, he was to be disappointed. Soon after Bertie's arrival, fellow officers smuggled a friendly young actress by the name of Nellie Clifton into his sleeping quarters. The prince recorded the momentous event in his personal diary.
6th of September, NC, first time. 9th of September, NC, second time. 10th of September, NC, third time.
Temptation comes, and, he's ready for it. He is brimming over with the desire to share the delights of this beautiful woman that pretty well is put in his bed. And when his father hears about this, of course, horror strikes him.
Bertie is weak in spirit and flesh, and you have this terrible tension between the ideals of monarchy and this ideal of this bourgeois, mid-Victorian, industrious, dutiful monarchy, and, what Bertie likes to get up to in the barracks. It's both an attack upon their ideal of family, but also, crucially, I think, Albert is very worried that it is undermining politically of the monarchy.
I write to you with a heavy heart on a subject that has caused me the deepest pain. I knew that you were thoughtless and weak, but I could not think you depraved.
Bertie couldn't have chosen a worse time to be caught in the act. His father, Prince Albert, already suffering the early symptoms of typhoid fever, was crushed with worry. When he died soon afterwards at Windsor Castle, it was Bertie who took the blame.
In the Queen's eyes, he was a martyr who had died because of the wickedness of his son. He'd sacrificed his life, and she never altogether forgave the Prince of Wales for what she saw as this appalling misdemeanor which led to the death of her beloved Albert.
Albert's death has a profoundly negative effect on the relationship between Bertie and Victoria. Victoria was completely, shocked and blames Bertie for Albert's death. Victoria, she says, you know, whenever I see Bertie, I shudder. I can't bear to have him in the room. I can't bear to be near him.
The prince had never enjoyed a warm relationship with his mother. For the next 40 years, it would be positively frosty. To keep her son and heir from further trouble, the Queen now resorted to a desperate remedy: marriage. The royal houses of Europe were scoured for a suitable partner. The winning candidate was the beautiful, albeit penniless, Alexandra of Denmark. In the 18-year-old princess, it seemed the matchmakers had found the perfect bride.
Alexandra was in fact an ideal wife for the Prince of Wales. Compared with the starchy correctness and the infinite tedium of Victoria's court, the Danish royal court was a delight for the Prince of Wales because they took everything cheerfully, and their idea of relaxation was the romps and practical jokes and jolly songs.
It was said about the Danish royal family that nobody was ever allowed to read a book, and if they saw you reading a book in the sitting room, they'd all run up after you and go boo, and that was really not all right. They wanted you to be galloping around and playing parlour games and throwing wet towels at each other.
In 1863, the 21-year-old Prince of Wales married his fun-loving Danish bride. For the wedding photograph, Queen Victoria arranged for Albert to join them, to make sure that nobody had too much fun. Installed in their opulent marital home, Marlborough House, the newlyweds quickly became the centre of London's high society. Amid a ceaseless round of dances, dinner parties and entertainments, Bertie's true personality could now flourish.
He knew that he wasn't clever like his father. He knew that he wasn't authoritative like his mother. What he had was a sort of charm, an easy way of dealing with people. People found him good company. He was well behaved. He knew what to say. He was a good person to be sitting next to at dinner.
It was an arranged marriage, and that was made completely plain. But I think that Alex, right from the start, really fell in love with him. And in a way, she remained in love with him for the rest of her life. She said to one of Bertie's sisters, "You think I'm marrying your brother because of his position, but if he was a cowboy, I'd marry him just the same."
The once lonely, isolated youth now had what he'd always craved: friendship, fun, and the unquestioning devotion of a beautiful woman. But as the royal family's most senior male representative, he also had unfulfilled ambitions.
The Prince of Wales felt, as the heir to the throne, he ought to be playing a prominent part in the affairs of state. And he was, in fact, very ready to do so. He was a man of considerable ability, great energy. The trouble was that his mother felt that he was irresponsible, frivolous, incapable of playing a serious role.
Bertie thought what he wanted to do was to have access to government papers, and particularly to Foreign Office dispatches, because he was always interested in foreign policy and saw that as his special area. And every time he asked for access to dispatches, and what he always asked for was the key. There was a particular gold key that opened the box of secret papers from the Foreign Office, and that's what he wanted. And Queen Victoria, whenever he asked, Queen Victoria would say, no, he can't have access. He is too indiscreet.
Edward said late in his mother's life that everyone had an eternal father, but he himself was blessed with an eternal mother. The sort of remark, in fact, that the present Prince of Wales might actually make. And of course, there is this permanent tension between the Prince of Wales, who is heir to the throne, and the person who's actually occupying it.
Frustrated in his ambition by his mother, relations between Bertie and his wife also began to come under pressure. 3 children in the first 4 years of marriage had taken the early sparkle out of married life. 8 months into her 3rd pregnancy, the princess fell gravely ill with rheumatic fever. The crisis was a turning point in the marriage.
It really played, I think, to his worst, his least likeable qualities. It's said that they had to send 3 telegrams to get him to come away from the races, to come to her sickbed. And when he did come, he didn't want to stay.
Bertie's reaction is not good. And he goes out night after night saying he'd be back, you know, and she waits up. And he says he'll be back at midnight, and he doesn't come back until 3, and she's meanwhile weeping, you know, very dependent on him.
The illness took a heavy physical toll on the princess, leaving her lame and increasingly deaf. It had also opened up deep underlying tensions in her relationship with the prince.
I think that he was mixed up, selfish, and perhaps a kind of sort of self-obsessed figure. I think the trouble perhaps partly was that Bertie's conflicted, because he was forced to marry her, and he resented that. I mean, 21, forced into an arranged marriage, no time to sow his wild oats, all of that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, he actually is very fond of her. And so that he treats her badly, but at the same time, he loves her. It's quite complicated, I think.
Over the coming years, Alexandra would increasingly retreat from society life behind the gates of her Sandringham home, while Bertie turned elsewhere to satisfy his emotional and physical needs.
There's no doubt he did like the company of women, and there's no doubt he had lots of mistresses. There are all these stories about him going off to Paris and going to brothels where there were, you know, lovely ladies.
He would haunt the Café Anglais, where orgies were said to occur. He would visit the Moulin Rouge, where one of the dancers said, "Hello, Wales, will you pay for my champagne?" And he did pay for her champagne.
There was this very celebrated brothel called La Charbonnet, where Bertie visited. There is a chair that was in that brothel that was displayed to people as Bertie's chair. And it's something that has been designed to allow a man to indulge in the sexual practices that he wants to do, you know, without breaking into a sweat, really.
He was at one point known as kinky, which is kind of awful, isn't it?
He would sit in this most incredible bath that had this sort of swan-necked mythological figure. And he would sit in this bath with a lady of his choice, not with water in there, but with champagne in there. And I guess they would both sit there and listen to the sound of his father spinning in his grave.
Bertie's frequent trips to the continent allowed him to indulge his peccadillos at a safe distance from his wife, his mother, and the prying eyes of the British press. But the prince had also begun to play dangerous games closer to home. And in 1870, his secret life was exposed in a most shocking public manner.
My great-great-grandmother was rather bubbly and rather frivolous, but obviously sort of rather amusing company. Everyone seems to have loved her. She was very popular.
In 1869, the Prince of Wales began a flirtation with the 21-year-old Lady Harriet Mordaunt, wife of a prominent member of Parliament.
He would pay her these afternoon visits. He would arrive in a hansom cab. He didn't come in his own carriage, so he obviously wanted to be discreet. Instructions were given to the servants that no one else was to be admitted if they came to call. The visits usually lasted for about an hour and a half. There was certainly time to get up to mischief if that's what they wanted to do.
In the summer of 1869, Harriet's husband, a keen sportsman, went on a fishing trip to Norway. Bertie took the opportunity to enjoy Harriet's company at her country residence, Walton Hall. What they couldn't have known was that 1869 was a miserable year for the Norwegian salmon. Sir Charles was back.
Sir Charles cuts short his holiday, arrives back unexpectedly, and he sees his wife driving around 2 white ponies, which Sir Charles had actually earlier bought from the Prince of Wales. And watching as they sort of prance around is the Prince of Wales himself. Sir Charles flies into the most appalling rage and instructs his gardener to take off these beautiful white ponies and shoot them, and he forces his wife to watch as they're shot.
Bertie beat a hasty retreat. Soon afterwards, a tearful Harriet confessed to sinning with the Prince of Wales and other men, often and in open day. Sir Charles was furious and vowed to divorce her. Bertie faced disgrace in the witness box of a public divorce trial. The case was front-page news. But the prince still had one supporter. Recently discovered letters revealed Princess Alexandra, at least, refused to see any ill in her husband.
My sweet Minnie, I have to mention to you a terrible scandal which has shocked everybody here more than words can tell. It is a man, Charles Mordaunt, a terrible brute who wants to be separated from his wife, who accused herself to be unfaithful and mentioned my Bertie as her lover. To see one's husband being accused in such a scandalous, mean way is nearly more than one can bear.
This was the first time for many centuries that the heir to the throne had appeared in court. I mean, this in itself was shocking. And the nature of the case was shocking too. It opened a window. It was a revelation to the public of the goings-on in the Prince of Wales's circles. I think it was a real crisis to Victorian public opinion, and it really did threaten the monarchy.
The Tory politician Lord Stanley noted,
"Another trial like that would create a Republican Party bent on putting an end to the monarchy. His folly almost amounts to insanity. No warning seems to have any effect."
On the 23rd of February 1870, a packed courtroom heard the prince deny any impropriety with Lady Mordaunt. But the damage to the prince and the crown's reputation had been done. As for Harriet, a worse fate awaited her.
Her family are thrown into a complete panic by the prospect of this sort of very lurid case. But her father decides that the thing to do is to say that Harriet's insane. They were very keen to sort of preserve the family honour. And although you might think it's a rather odd way to go about it by establishing that you've got a lunatic in the family, somehow that was considered preferable to the fact that you had this very, very promiscuous young woman.
Lady Harriet was committed to a lunatic asylum. She died there 36 years later.
It's an absolutely appalling story. It is like something straight out of Wilkie Collins, a true Gothic horror story. The fate of a sort of young woman who steps out of line was very grim indeed, if that suited society and the men around her.
Bertie's reckless behaviour had contributed to the ruin of a young woman and tarnished the monarchy's image at a time of growing Republican sentiment. The jeers Bertie suffered in public were as nothing to the roasting he was about to receive from his mother.
He really is more and more careless, being dragged into the dirt and mixed up in one of the most disgusting and scandalous trials on record.
Victoria was appalled to learn that the Prince of Wales was behaving badly. But on the other hand, the other side of it was that the more intelligence she could accumulate of Bertie's bad behaviour, the more she could say, well, he is absolutely not fit to be king. You know, he's a wastrel. He's completely no good. I must stay with all the power. He cannot be trusted.
Queen Victoria wasn't very good at sharing responsibility. She didn't even like doing it with Albert very much, who she absolutely adored. And so she really did her best to try and prevent him from any kind of serious duty. And some of the heads of the administrations that she dealt with agreed. Disraeli didn't want a sensitive document of any sort to be put into Bertie's hands. And he was probably right, because when he was given things, you know, he had the tendency to kind of pass them around at dinner parties and ask the guests what they thought. You know, this wasn't really very useful behaviour.
Bertie grew increasingly disgruntled at his mother's refusal to share power. He poured out his anger in a letter to his private secretary.
The game is not to let me see any interesting or important dispatches. This has been going on for years under successive governments, and it would be far better if the Foreign Office sent me no more, which is preferable to the rubbish they do send.
Because he's not trusted with this kind of material, he is more or less infantilized. Cartoons of the period will depict him as a baby in a pram. He's not going to be allowed to involve himself much in the serious business of state. So he turns pleasure into a serious business and commits himself to that, so that the complexities of his social diary and what parties he's going to actually, in a way, take the place of sitting there with a red box going through the documents. And it's almost as if his energies are diverted into that.
As youth gave way to an increasingly corpulent middle age, the prince threw himself body and soul into a life of leisure.
He lived an extraordinarily raffish existence. First of all, there was the food. He had, by modern standards, the Edwardian gluttony was simply something to amaze you. Huge breakfasts, mid-morning meals, 8-course lunches, tea, and 12-course dinners, and then sandwiches, before you go to bed. But in the meantime, he would go out and he would attend the music hall. He would go to cockpits, he would go to billiard rooms that were showing pornographic photographs, he would go to brothels. A moment would not go by when he was not diverted.
Bertie did have this sort of gargantuan appetite for everything, and I think a lot of it does come out of having this miserable childhood where he feels that things are constantly denied him.
When he wasn't devouring a favourite midnight feast of cold roast chicken, Bertie continued to work his way through a series of mistresses, including model-turned-actress Lily Langtry and one Jenny Churchill, mother of a pushy young lad named Winston. Then, at the age of 48, something odd happened. Perhaps for the first time in his life, Bertie fell in love.
Daisy Warwick was the original it girl, a combination of beauty and charm all rolled into one. She was one of those society beauties that had their likeness put onto these little cards, and you could buy them in the shops.
Daisy, Countess of Warwick, was 20 years younger than the Prince of Wales, fabulously rich and thoroughly scandalous. At her grand homes Warwick Castle and Easton Lodge in Essex, she was famous for hosting lavish entertainments.
Daisy Warwick was incredibly extravagant. She spent money like there was no tomorrow. She had her own railway branch built to bring guests to her house. Luxury everywhere. And these were the sort of famously racy house parties where Daisy sort of organised adultery, really.
There would be flowers on your dressing table, and there were buttonholes for the men. There were printed lists of who was there for dinner and who you were to take into dinner. You didn't touch each other, but there were ways of little notes being left by the candles saying, "Come and see me, I'm in room," whatever.
It was at one such house party in 1886 that Bertie was introduced to the Countess. Although their 10-year affair would become common knowledge, documentary evidence of the relationship has been scarce. Until now.
The affair with Daisy Warwick was incredibly intense, but the thing about it is that until very recently, nobody actually knew what went on between them. It was a sort of puzzle because there was absolutely no evidence at all. But then, looking at the diary that Bertie kept, I suddenly realised that there was a symbol that I didn't understand that he seemed to be putting in, which seemed to be occurring increasingly frequently, sometimes twice a day.
Bertie's diaries reveal the philandering prince was using code to cover his tracks. A letter D written backwards, signifying his increasingly frequent liaisons with Daisy.
It's possible from this to see very clearly that this was an incredibly intense relationship. He would meet Daisy twice a day. He'd have tea with her every day when she was in London. He'd meet her in the morning. They'd have intimate suppers in the evening. He called her my darling Daisy wife. It was a sort of second marriage.
I think she could fairly be described as the love of his life. He wrote to her several times a day. He saw her all the time and went to stay with her. I think he was strongly, strongly devoted to her.
My own lovely little Daisy. Tomorrow I go to the races. I have 2 horses running, but I fear they are not any good. Don't forget, my darling, to expect me from 5 on Sunday next. I only wish it could be before. Good night, and God keep you, my adored little Daisy.